Hastings had always maintained that England, for all its quiet hedgerows and civilized tea tables, knew how to lay out a piece of theater when it chose. That evening in late September, as the estuary winds pressed a grey silk of cloud over the Blackwater and the sea drew back respectful of the treacherous flats, he felt the familiar shiver that precedes a curtain's rise. The causeway, revealed by the retreating tide, lay like a dull, tarnished ribbon between the mainland and Seabourn House, a long, low Georgian building with a white pediment and a foolish little folly on the lawn that looked as though some ancestor had set it there to amuse posterity and then forgot to tell them why. He had come at the invitation of Colonel Lucius Vaughan, formerly of the 15th Hussars, now a gentleman who fished, grumbled about Parliament, and played a fair hand of whist. They were to dine at Seabourn House in honor of Lady Constance Greville's birthday weekend, a minor event in the county, but one that collected an assortment of neighbors, estranged relations, and dependents with the inevitability of a tide bringing in driftwood. Vaughan, while not a sentimental man, had a soldier's loyalty. Lady Constance's late husband had commanded the regiment for a year in South Africa, and the caste had never quite drifted apart since. "You will enjoy the company," Vaughan had said crisply as the motor rattled over the causeway's rough stones. "A pretty assortment of motives, vanities, and old quarrels, if you care to look. Constance is all graciousness, of course, never an unkindness for which she will not presently atone with a kindness. But the Grevilles have managed their affairs badly. There will be talk of settlements. And there is that Locket business. I tell you, these trinkets start wars." "Locket," said Hastings. Vaughan shrugged. "Silver, oval, old. Constance's mother had it. Family whispers of a secret compartment and a miniature too scandalous for the sunlight. These things always have secret compartments. Last month it went missing and last week it reappeared, as such objects do, on the dressing table, with the chain shortened by 2 links. Constance says no more about it, but watch her hand stray to her throat. A woman's fingers betray her." The house came into view at a curve in the road. It had not the grandeur of a great hall, but wore its age with that modest good breeding which is the envy of new money. There was a clock in the pediment, and beyond the lawn a short flight of steps led down to the shingle. A boathouse crouched by the water, its doors half open like sleepy eyelids. From somewhere inland came the faint cry of a train on the Malden line, 5:12, Hastings thought, automatic in these island calculations. A gust brought the scent of salt and something sweeter, violets, perhaps, those Parma violets that cling to certain ladies as persistently as some memories do. At the door, Mrs. Drake, the housekeeper, greeted them with the serious efficiency of a woman for whom linens and tempers were separate but equally launderable things. She had an unflappable face that had learned to betray precisely the degree of catastrophe appropriate to a burnt pudding or a collapsed mortgage. "Colonel Vaughan, Captain Hastings," she announced over her shoulder, and as they were divested of coats Hastings noticed a map on the hall table, neat, on stout paper, with a red pencil line tracing the tidal hours. High tide, 7:20 p.m. had been written in a careful hand along the top, a small asterisk inked beside it, and underneath, in a lighter pencil as though added later, telephone unreliable after storm. Mr. Kemp to check wires, Tuesday. Mr. Kemp was Sir Alastair Greville's valet, a narrow man in black who moved like a shadow with schedules where other men kept hearts. "Tea in the blue drawing-room," Mrs. Drake intoned. "Dinner at 8. The men from the station arrived at 5:30 and are showing themselves about, as they will. The gardener says the west gate sticks. I've told him a gentleman cannot be tugging at municipal woodwork in his evening wear, but he is stubborn as elm and will be at it with a spade. Mind the tiles, Colonel, they've been polished." Hastings smiled and allowed himself to be led through rooms that looked as though someone had opened a Regency dream and politely dusted it. The blue drawing-room had a watercolor of the estuary. The artist, in an admirable effort to please everyone, had managed to make the mud look picturesque. On the mantel-shelf, a French ormolu clock preened itself. It declared, with the cheerfulness of the inaccurate, that it was 10 minutes past 4. Someone had placed, deliberately and perhaps with humor, a folded note beneath it, where Hastings could not help but observe a neat hand. 10:15, remember. Remember what? He might have passed a remark had the company not commanded his attention. Lady Constance Greville rose from a wing-backed chair near the window. She had the fine bones and determined jaw of women who manage counties when men will only manage fields. Her hair, ash-blonde, was arranged with the confidence of someone who trusts an excellent maid and an exemplary mirror. At her throat lay a silver locket, oval, delicately chased, familiar to those who knew the family portraits. Hastings saw at once what Vaughan meant. Even as she spoke she touched it, first idly and then as though her fingers sought confirmation. There was a faint mark on the chain where 2 links might once have been. They had been removed and the chain shortened. Such tiny alterations make a habit of shouting in a quiet room. "Colonel! Captain Hastings!" she cried, with that warmth which is not indiscriminate but graciously inclusive. "I am absurdly glad to see you. Alistair will be charmed. He is counting his figures again and needs rescuing." Sir Alistair Greville, when introduced, looked exactly like a man who had made bad investments and was determined to make worse. He had the square, sun-faded face of a gentleman who rides when he can still afford the horse and thinks money is chiefly a matter of other people's tact. He shook hands distractedly and spoke of repairs to the seawall and the price of barley, and then, almost apologetically, of the necessity, tiresome, unavoidable, of consulting Mr. Bryce, the family solicitor. They distributed themselves in those tedious groups that English drawing-rooms encourage and that conceal, like flower-beds, cunning networks beneath. There was Julia Greville, Sir Alistair's niece, a dark, still woman whose composure deserved a better word than coldness. She looked as though she had made her peace with something, and Hastings detected, in the shadow about her eyes, a young lady's determination not to weep. Beside her, Mr. Felix Hart, the jeweler from Bond Street, slim, fastidious, with a thin professional smile that opened and closed like a cigarette case. He had come ostensibly to bring a repaired brooch, but like all men who have the right to glance at women's throats, he saw more than most and spoke less. Near the hearth stood Dr. Lionel Markham, the local physician, square-shouldered, faintly sardonic, with a habit of pinching the bridge of his nose. He had, Hastings noticed, a slight left-handedness. The ink on his second finger testified to it, and when he took out his watch it was with the wrong hand. He observed people with the developed faculty of those accustomed to being lied to politely. He had a toleration for human folly that sometimes looks, to the untrained observer, like cynicism. Beyond him, a man whose American vowels rolled like polished marbles out of his mouth. Mr. Morton Hale, of Chicago, tall, handsome, wearing prosperity as a tailor might wear a tape, easily. He talked, when he spoke at all, of shipping and hotels and the oddness of English plumbing, and he had a way of looking at Seabourn House as though it were a property advertisement that had not yet made up its mind about him. There is a manner, Hastings reflected, of being very much at home anywhere. It is often mistaken for good breeding. Add to these a Reverend Sinclair, pale, bespectacled, with a gentle obstinacy, and the Colonel's widow sister, Mrs. Rosalind Vaughan, whose bright laughter lived only 2 inches from some private grief, and Miss Eleanor Reeves, Lady Constance's companion secretary, a woman made of neat lines and careful ink. Then one had nearly the cast required by any proper English comedy or tragedy, depending on the orchestra. "I hope the tide will behave," Lady Constance said. "It comes up like a cat on this coast, softly and with its own mind. We must send for those who are to cross after dinner. Mr. Hart, you will remain with us." "If I may presume upon Lady Constance's kindness," Mr. Hart murmured. "In London, one dines and hurries away. Here, one would be a fool." "Then stay," she said. "At Seabourn, we make heaven of sloth." Tea flowed, and with it that slight relaxation after the day's pretense. Hastings, inclined by temperament to contentment, watched. The room had an odd rhythm. Silences fell in corners like handkerchiefs, picked up and pocketed by those who had dropped them. The boathouse door creaked. Someone, perhaps the gardener, crossed the lawn quickly, his boots leaving precise signatures in the damp. A setter lifted its head and uttered one peculiar bark at the window, as though recognizing and disapproving a particular pair of boots. "Will you look?" said Mrs. Vaughan, her voice lowered. "Poor Julia wears her calm too tightly. And notice how Hale keeps to the edge of things. Americans in an old house always step as though they will break it." Hastings's eye, drawn by some smaller magnet, returned again to the locket. Lady Constance touched it when she laughed. Miss Reeves, as she handed more sugar, glanced at it with a faint anxiety, then away, as though refusing an association. Mr. Hart, with that curious fastidiousness, did not look at it at all. And once, only once, Hastings saw Julia's gaze rest upon it with an expression that might have been envy or distaste. The two, in certain lights, are indistinguishable. Sir Alistair drifted towards him. "You know London," he said abruptly. "You know prices. One cannot live on wheat and sentiment. There is Bryce's advice, and then there is what one does. Hart is a decent fellow. He knows values. It is a woman's trinket, of course. No use to a man. Though my mother wore it. Constance is attached to it." He checked himself, smiled in a manner that pledged discretion to a promise it had not been invited to make. "I talk too much. Old men do. When I am gone, what will they have? This house, perhaps, and a folly the taxman will be too literal to enjoy." The housekeeper entered with the quiet announcement of practical matters. "The telephone is hissing again, my lady. Mr. Kemp says the wires were loosened in the gale. The Malden Exchange could hear me if I raised my voice, but I will not be shouting into the ears of strangers at my age. Dinner at 8, as said. Mr. Bryce called to say his train was delayed by 10 minutes and that he will cross before the high tide if the trap meets him on time." "Mr. Bryce crossing at 7, Lady Constance repeated, half to herself. "Very well. We must send Perkins at once. Thank you, Drake. Also," Mrs. Drake added, "Mr. Markham left a parcel in the hall. I have placed it on the small table by the clock. He requested it be kept cool." A faint flicker passed over the doctor's face. "A medical preparation," the doctor said smoothly. "Boring precautions. The bottles do better upright. Not a drama to be had in it." "You will find one if you look," observed Reverend Sinclair mildly. "There is drama in keeping things alive and quietly going. It simply lacks witnesses." The talk shifted to the Westgate, how it stuck in damp weather. This produced a minor battle plan between the colonel and the gardener, Mr. Pritchard, who appeared at the French doors with a cap in both hands and mud up to the ankle. "Beg pardon, lady. Tide's turning. If I might have the boathouse key. Mr. Kemp took it for the new chain and hasn't returned it. Boat's best in for the night if there's to be blow." "The key," said Lady Constance, turning to Miss Reeves. "In the hall on the iron hook, my lady," Miss Reeves replied. "I placed it there after luncheon." Hastings, whose soldier's habit made him notice the small machinery of a house, had seen the row of hooks beneath the framed tide table. Boat, cellar, Westgate, each neatly labeled in Miss Reeves's handwriting. The boat hook was empty. "Kemp is meticulous," Lady Constance said. "If the key is absent, it is for a reason." "Meticulous men make the finest mistakes," murmured Hart, with a little smile that played about his lips like a moth about a candle. "One sees it in diamonds. A cunning cut can break the light in exactly the wrong place." When tea had been drunk and the first pallor of evening began to press itself against the windows, the company drifted to their rooms. Hastings, shown along a passage whose walls had that faded sea blue beloved by houses that wished to be on amiable terms with damp, admired the framed sketch of the grounds, a plan, evidently amateur but patient, of lawns and the folly and the narrow path that ran behind the shrubbery to the west gate. The path's curve had been shaded darker, perhaps to suggest overgrown laurels. At the bottom someone had written in small, precise letters, "Beware the soft earth by the sundial after rain." It had rained in the night. Hastings could see the prints of some heel, narrow and sharp, on the gravel turn below the landing window. A woman's shoe, he thought. No, not necessarily. There are men who dress their feet as they dress their opinions, in points. At his door he paused. A faint scent of violets again. He could not place it. Not Miss Reeves, whose perfume would be a ledger entry, nor Julia, whose toilette appeared to be a matter of principle. Lady Constance, perhaps. Some ladies keep a particular scent as a signature. He made a note of it in that mental scrapbook of small oddities which army life had trained him to keep, along with the curious little scorch mark he had seen on the edge of the drawing-room grate, where a letter had been burnt hastily and not well, and the way Reverend Sinclair had placed his hat carefully on the chair edge, as though expecting to pick it up in a hurry. Dressing for dinner, he caught himself smiling at his own fussiness. He had acquired it, he knew, by contagion. One does not accompany Hercule Poirot through a sufficient number of small wars and large drawing-rooms without beginning to care for the order of things, the proper angle of a tie, the exact alignment of objects upon a mantelpiece. Poirot would have noticed more. Poirot always did. He was not expected, of course. This was a small country party, unimportant in the great scheme of crime and consequence. And yet, as Hastings went down, the house seemed to have tucked its secrets into its pockets and to be waiting, breath held, for someone to ask the correct question. Dinner was a carefully choreographed affair, all silver and understatement. Mr. Bryce, the solicitor, arrived at 10 minutes past 7, apologizing to the Tide, which had no sense of time and would not be appeased. He was a compact, brisk man whose spectacles glinted with the relish of clauses. He took in the company as one reads a balance sheet and sat where Miss Reeves indicated, with the obsequious gratitude of one who knows the value of secretaries. Conversation at table fell into agreeable channels. The sale of a neighboring farm, Dr. Markham's new assistant who rode a bicycle with unseemly speed through the village, Mr. Hale's polite amazement at English portions. Mr. Hart spoke, when prodded, of an Elizabethan ring recovered from a pawnshop whose owner had thought the blackened diamond worthless. "It is often the little things that fetch the price," he said. "A tiny flaw, a signature in the metal. One must have patience to find the difference between paste and a thing with a past." He smiled at his own wordplay, then fell silent. Twice, during the soup and the fish, a queer little ripple passed down the table. It had to do, Hastings felt, with the word settlements. Mr. Bryce used it with the casual brutality of a surgeon discussing a necessary amputation. Sir Alistair winced. Julia grew stiller, if such restraint were possible. Lady Constance's hand, he could not help it, went to the locket and then, with a tiny effort, away. Miss Reeves, without looking up, wrote a quick figure in the small notebook that lived invisibly at her wrist. A figure? A time? She shut it with a quiet finality. After the suite, there came coffee in the library, with the French windows on a crack to admit the sound of the tide, which had returned to fence them off from the world. The ormolu clock in the drawing-room chimed somewhere with cheerful inaccuracy. The clock in the pediment outside, if it chimed at all, did so for the gulls. A squall threw needles of rain against the pane and then, as quickly, retreated. The telephone rattled once in the hall, in that hissing, faraway manner that told of wires fretted by wind, and Mrs. Drake, after a brief exchange with the exchange, reported that someone had called and run out of patience or courage. Sir Alistair produced a decanter and the mild boasting of a man who has so little to boast of that his cellar must suffice. Mr. Hale expressed an intention of walking out to smoke by the boathouse. The colonel cautioned him against the path by the sundial, soft after rain. "I am a light man," Hale laughed. "I tread easy." "It is not weight that sinks a man," said Dr. Markham in his dry way. "It is certainty." Shortly after 10 the party broke. Doors shut softly, footsteps receded, somewhere a bolt was drawn. Hastings, pausing at the foot of the stairs to glance once more at the map with the red pencil marks, noticed a small smear of blue-gray clay beneath the West Gate label, as though some thumb, recently soiled, had steadied itself there. He thought, inconsequently, of the gardener's ankles, of the dog's singular bark, of a chain shortened by exactly 2 links. The ormolu clock in the blue drawing-room, bland, wrong, smiled on at 10:15. Someone had slipped the folded note deeper beneath it so that only the word remember showed, shy as an afterthought. He slept badly. The house creaked in its old joints. The tide muttered to the shore. Once, far on the edge of hearing, there came a sound like metal briefly touching stone, then silence. He dreamed of a woman's hand straying to her throat, and of silver that would not open until the right question had been asked. Morning would bring weather and breakfast, and the same small courtesies that keep the English from asking one another what they mean. And after that, though Hastings could not know it, could only feel the house set like a stage, would come the event that turns a party into a story. On the dressing table, in the half-light, the flower of a violet lay as though forgotten. It perfumed nothing, and promised, like all small deliberate things, too much. The morning broke with a thin mist rising from the estuary, curling like cigarette smoke across the lawn and hanging in pale veils around the folly. Hastings, waking from uneasy dreams, found himself staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of Seabourne House and listening to the muffled sounds of servants already at their work. The tide had gone out. He could hear the sigh of distant gulls and, closer, the soft scrape of someone moving cautiously along the gravel path beneath his window. The scent of violets lingered faintly in the air, though there were no flowers in his room. Hastings frowned, wondering whether it had clung to his coat from the drawing-room the night before. Then a bell rang below, sharp and metallic, echoing through the old house like a summons. By the time Hastings had dressed and descended, the household was in an odd state of half-suppressed agitation. Mrs. Drake, formidable even in her starched morning apron, moved briskly through the hall with orders for tea and smelling salts. The setter barked again at the door, once, an accusing sound. Voices came from the blue drawing room, raised in excitement and confusion. Hastings entered and stopped short. Lady Constance Greville was seated in her wing chair by the window, her usually calm composure broken. She clutched at her throat, where the familiar oval locket should have rested, but now hung only an empty chain, snapped near the clasp. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something more than distress, fear, perhaps, or disbelief. Sir Alistair hovered beside her, his hand half raised in a gesture of protection or helplessness. Julia Greville stood a little apart, silent, her dark eyes fixed on the broken chain as though it confirmed something she had dreaded. Mr. Hart, the jeweler, bent over the floor near Lady Constance's chair, his keen gaze scanning the carpet. And on the rug itself, incongruously out of place, lay the silver locket, open. Its tiny hinge gleamed, though the miniature within was curiously smudged, as if hastily rubbed. It was not the locket that drew the gasps of the company, however, but what lay beside it. A man's body. Morton Hale, the American, sprawled on his side, his handsome features oddly slack, his open eyes staring blankly at the ormolu clock on the mantelpiece. His right hand still clutched the stem of a wineglass, now empty, a faint trace of liquid staining the carpet beneath. His lips were tinged with a faint bluish hue. There was no mistaking the stillness. Morton Hale was dead. "Good heavens!" Hastings exclaimed, stepping forward. "What has happened here?" Dr. Markham, already crouched by the body, glanced up with grim finality. "Poison," he said shortly. "The symptoms are plain enough. I should say cyanide, from the odor. Death would have been swift." A murmur ran through the assembled group. Reverend Sinclair made the sign of the cross with trembling fingers. Miss Reeves, pale but composed, wrote something swiftly in her little notebook before closing it again with a snap. Sir Alistair's voice cracked as he spoke. But this is monstrous. In my house, at Constance's table." Colonel Vaughan stood stiffly, fists clenched. "The fellow was in good health last night. There must be some explanation. Who gave him that glass?" Lady Constance gave a low cry and pressed her handkerchief to her lips. "He poured it himself," she whispered. "I saw him. He had gone to the sideboard for brandy." "Oh, Alistair, what dreadful thing has happened here?" Hastings, his soldier's instinct awakened, looked keenly around the room. The sideboard stood against the wall, bottles and decanters neatly arrayed. The stopper of the brandy decanter lay beside it, as though dropped in haste. On the tray near Hale's hand was another glass, untouched. But it was the ormolu clock that drew his attention next. The foolish French timepiece ticked with airy unconcern, its hands pointing to exactly 10:15. And tucked beneath it still was the folded note Hastings had glimpsed the previous evening, now thrust farther in, so that only the single word "remember" remained visible. Dr. Markham rose, dusting his hands with the detached efficiency of his profession. "We must send for the police at once. This is no accident. The man has been deliberately poisoned." "Poisoned?" repeated Sir Alistair, aghast. "But who? Why?" Vaughan's jaw tightened. "There will be questions enough for all of us. We are cut off by the tide until noon. No one enters, no one leaves." He turned to Hastings, his eyes narrowing. "By God, I wish Poirot were here. This is a case for him, not for the village constable." At that moment, a discreet cough came from the doorway. There he stood, immaculate, composed, mustaches twirled to perfection, eyes alight with the satisfaction of a man who arrives precisely where fate requires him. Hercule Poirot. "Ah, my friends," he said softly, stepping into the room. "You have need, I think, of the little gray cells." It was, Hastings reflected, the most extraordinary coincidence that Hercule Poirot should have appeared at the very moment his presence was most required. But then, coincidences seldom survived under Poirot's exacting inspection. He would have smiled indulgently and murmured something about order and method, as though fate itself could be compelled to obey him. Poirot bowed slightly in Lady Constance's direction, his patent leather shoes gleaming in the misty light that filtered through the tall windows. His immaculate gray suit and polished cane looked almost incongruous against the tension that filled the room. "My lady," he said gravely, Forgive the intrusion. I had not thought to disturb your party. But the Colonel," he inclined his head towards Vaughn, "is an old comrade, and he extended to me an invitation most pressing. I was already on my way when—" his eyes slid to the body of Morton Hale. "I see that circumstances have rendered my presence necessary." Lady Constance, her composure struggling with shock, managed a faint smile of relief. "Monsieur Poirot, if ever there was a moment when we needed your skill, it is now. You see," she faltered and gestured helplessly at the lifeless figure on the carpet. Poirot raised one hand gently. "I see, madam. Already I see." He moved with surprising swiftness to the body and bent, his fingers delicate as a watchmaker's. He did not touch at random. Every gesture was precise, every glance deliberate. He leaned closer, inhaled faintly, then nodded. "Cyanide," he murmured. "Yes, the good doctor is correct. The odor, it cannot be mistaken. Death has been rapid. But tell me, who has touched him since?" "No one," Dr. Markham said, his tone brusque. "I examined him when he fell, but otherwise the body has not been disturbed." Poirot inclined his head. "Très bien. It is important. Later we shall move him, but for the present he remains." He turned suddenly, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. "You are all assembled, yes? Lady Constance, your guests, they are all here." "All except Mr. Bryce," she answered. "He breakfasted early and returned to his room with papers." "But he will be sent for." "Send for no one, madam," Poirot replied. "At this stage, the gathering must not scatter. A chain is strongest when each link is visible. Later, the police will arrive. Until then, I beg you, patience, calm, and no wandering alone. Murder, MES Amos, has been committed. And where there is murder, there is also a murderer." A murmur ran around the company, like a draft through the room. Julia Greville's face remained impassive, but her hands clenched together in her lap. Miss Reeves's pencil twitched nervously across a page before she closed the notebook again. Felix Hart stood quite still, his eyes narrowed, lips pressed thin. Reverend Sinclair whispered a prayer under his breath. Poirot moved to the sideboard. He examined the array of bottles with the air of a man reading a secret message. His fingertips lingered on the stopper of the brandy decanter. He sniffed lightly, shook his head. "It is not the brandy that is poisoned," he declared. "See, there are 2 glasses. One used, one not. The dead man poured for himself, but which glass did he lift? And observe," he bent low, peering at the rug near Hale's body. "A small fragment of glass here, a chip. One of the rims has been filed, perhaps, or tampered with. We shall know more presently." Lady Constance shivered. "But why, monsieur? Why Morton Hale? He was our guest. He had no enemies here." Poirot's mustaches twitched. "No enemies? Forgive me, madam, but in my experience, it is those who smile most broadly at dinner who often have knives beneath the tablecloth." He straightened and gestured towards the silver locket lying open on the rug. "And here we have another curiosity. Last night it was at your throat. This morning it lies beside the victim. How does this come to be? The chain is broken, yes. But the timing, it is too exact. Something links this trinket with death." Her hand went instinctively to her bare throat. I do not understand. The clasp must have snapped when I bent over, perhaps when I stooped to help him. The locket fell beside him, that is all." "Perhaps," said Poirot softly. He closed the locket carefully, his fingers brushing its surface as though weighing more than the silver. "Or perhaps not. We shall see." Hastings, who had been watching with growing impatience, burst out. "But look here, Poirot, if cyanide was used, it must have been in the drink. Surely that makes it simple enough. Only those near the sideboard could have tampered with it." Poirot turned and regarded his old friend with affectionate amusement. "Ah, Hastings, always the gallant charge forward. You see a single door and rush through it. But murder, it is a house of many rooms. We must open each one, quietly, and examine what is inside before we decide which room holds the killer." He paced to the ormolu clock on the mantelpiece, its hands still pointing to 10:15. He plucked the folded note from beneath it and held it up. Remember, he read aloud. Always, Hastings, there is something to remember. The clock is wrong, yet the note insists upon time. Why? For whom is this message? He tapped the note thoughtfully against his chin. There was a silence. Every face turned away, as though guilty in its own small fashion. Poirot smiled, but his eyes were sharp. I will ask each of you, he said, to tell me what you saw this morning, what you heard, and where you were. Already, there are small discrepancies in the air, like dust motes in sunlight. Soon they will settle. And then, he spread his hands in a neat gesture, we shall know who among us has exchanged courtesy for crime. He paused. But one thing more, until the police arrive, I take responsibility. No one leaves this house. We are cut off by the tide, yes? Then let the tide serve us. A circle has formed, a circle of suspects. And Hercule Poirot, Immerse, he will look within it. Lady Constance gave a faint sob. Colonel Vaughan muttered an oath beneath his breath. And Hastings, with a curious foreboding, knew that the peaceful birthday gathering had become something infinitely darker, a stage upon which his friend, the greatest detective in Europe, would play out another terrible and brilliant performance. The drizzle traced long silver streaks down the tall windows, and the tide muttered beyond the shingle. Poirot had arranged himself in the blue drawing-room as though it were his courtroom. 2 chairs angled near the hearth, a space clear before him, and the rest of the company gathered like a jury compelled to watch. He folded his hands across the ivory handle of his cane and regarded them in turn. We shall proceed with order, he said gently. Each will tell me what they saw, what they heard, where they were. It is the small thing, the color of a coat, the sound of a step, that betrays the truth. And remember this, the murderer is among us. Colonel Vaughan rose stiffly, his manner that of a soldier summoned before a tribunal. He described his breakfast at 8:30 in the small dining room, in the company of Lady Constance, Sir Alistair, and Miss Reeves. Morton Hale, he added, had appeared 10 minutes past 9, grumbling about the damp and eating little. At the time of the discovery, he had been in the hall with Mrs. Drake, discussing the troublesome West Gate. He had left Hale alive not 10 minutes before. Poirot listened with narrowed eyes, nodding only once. You did not see him pour the glass? No, the colonel said firmly. Alive and on his feet when I left him. Lady Constance's voice came next, quiet but trembling. She confirmed breakfast, her return to the drawing-room, and Morton Hale's presence there by the window. They had exchanged only trivial words about the tide. She had scarcely seated herself when he coughed, staggered, and fell. She had bent to him, she said, and at that instant the locket must have snapped from her chain. Poirot asked gently to examine the clasp. His fingers turned the broken links with infinite care. It is curious, he murmured. A strong chain does not break of itself. There is force here, not accident. We shall not forget this. Sir Alistair spoke next, his manner distracted, his gaze drifting to the shelves as though searching there for rescue. He admitted to pacing the library after breakfast, figures and accounts weighing upon him. At the sound of Lady Constance's cry, he had rushed in from the adjoining room. Poirot inquired whether he had touched the bottles on the sideboard that morning. Sir Alistair flushed and shook his head. I drink with company, he said. Never alone. I had not so much as removed a stopper. Julia Greville's account followed. She had not joined the family for breakfast at all. A headache had kept her in her room until shortly after 9, when she descended. She had passed through the hall and seen Hale enter the drawing-room with Lady Constance already there. A few moments later she heard the cry and ran back to find him collapsed. Poirot studied her with grave attentiveness. You heard nothing before. The sound of glass, perhaps? She hesitated only briefly before saying no. Felix Hart, precise as a craftsman setting a jewel, stated that he had walked the terrace after breakfast, noting the effect of light on the estuary. He had re-entered the drawing-room at the instant of commotion. Poirot's gaze lingered on his manicured hands. You handle many delicate things, monsieur. Did you notice the locket upon the lady's throat last night? Hart smiled thinly. I notice everything, but it is not my habit to comment. Dr. Markham recounted his inspection of the body with brisk detachment. He had eaten sparingly and gone to his study to prepare medicines. Returning towards the drawing room, he had been summoned by the uproar. He spoke with authority on the symptoms of cyanide poisoning. Poirot asked whether he had stored chemicals in the house. The doctor admitted to leaving a parcel in the hall, sealed and clearly labeled, but insisted none of it was dangerous in the present form. Reverend Sinclair confessed to a solitary walk in the garden after breakfast. The quiet, he said, suited his prayers. He had been within sight of the boathouse when the cry carried through the damp air. His soft, precise tones did little to relieve the tension. Poirot regarded him with courtesy, but pressed no further. Miss Reeves, composed despite her pallor, admitted that she had kept close to Lady Constance all morning, assisting with correspondence. She had been in and out of the drawing room, she said, but had seen nothing unusual until the collapse. Poirot asked why she wrote in her notebook at that very moment. She colored faintly. "It is my habit to mark times," she replied. "When letters are dictated, when visitors arrive. It keeps the household orderly." Lastly, Mrs. Drake was questioned. Her report was plain. The gardener at the west gate, the storm loosening the telephone wires, her own conversation with the colonel in the hall. She had seen nothing of Hale's glass. Yet Poirot observed her face carefully, as though testing the strength of a beam in an old house. When all had spoken, Poirot leaned back, tapping his cane softly against the rug. "Voila! We have heard many accounts. Each is plausible, each courteous. Yet they do not all agree. Already there are small gaps. Who was in the room, who was outside, what was heard, what was not. It is in these gaps that murder hides. We shall look there." His eyes moved from face to face. None met them willingly. The storm thickened outside. The estuary was a sheet of gray. The tide, indifferent to human tragedy, had risen high enough to isolate the house. Within its walls, Poirot had begun his careful weaving of alibis, motives, and contradictions, one thread at a time. The drizzle slackened by midday, though the sky remained heavy with cloud. Seabourn House seemed to contract in on itself as the tide closed around the causeway, isolating the company. Meals were set out, but little was eaten. The clink of cutlery sounded almost indecent. Everyone waited for the arrival of the police launch from Malden, yet Poirot held the stage, his presence as commanding as if Scotland Yard itself had ceded authority. He summoned the household again to the blue drawing room. The body of Morton Hale had been respectfully removed to an adjoining chamber, but its memory lingered like an unwelcome guest. Poirot stood before the mantelpiece, his fingers adjusting a candlestick by a fraction of an inch. When he turned, his eyes were bright. "Mess Amos, you are troubled." "Naturally. Murder intrudes where laughter was meant to reign. And now suspicion, it intrudes also. But order, logic, method, they shall protect us." He gestured towards the sideboard. "I have examined again the glasses. One, you will observe, bears a faint etching along the rim, so faint it might escape notice. Someone had tampered with it, yes? A scratch deep enough to conceal the merest trace of poison." A ripple went through the assembly. Sir Alistair muttered something about scandal and disgrace. Poirot raised a finger. "Patience. Let us consider who had opportunity. Who handles glass with delicacy? Who has the knowledge of small compartments, of tiny flaws?" His gaze settled deliberately on Felix Hart, the jeweler. All eyes followed. Hart remained composed, though his lips tightened. "Jewelers," Poirot continued, "they are accustomed to the minute, the unseen. A cut here, a scratch there, it makes the difference between splendor and ruin. And last night, Monsieur Hart spoke of just this. He told us that a cunning cut may break the light in the wrong place. Did he speak of diamonds, or of glass?" There was a sharp intake of breath from Lady Constance. Julia Greville's dark eyes flickered with something like triumph. Hart's voice, when it came, was cool but taut. "You suggest I poisoned a guest under your hostess's roof? Absurd. I had no quarrel with the man." "No quarrel," Colonel Vaughan interjected. "I saw you, Hart. You and Hale spoke in low tones after dinner. There was an edge in your voice. A quarrel, sure enough." Hart's cheeks colored faintly. "We disagreed on a business matter, nothing more. Hale had asked me to value certain stones he had purchased in America. They were worthless paste." He did not enjoy hearing the truth. Poirot spread his hands. Voila! A motive, humiliation, anger. And yet, motive is not guilt. He moved suddenly, stooping to pick up a small object from the hearthrug. See, what do we have here? A sliver of glass, no larger than a fingernail. It matches the scratch upon the rim. Who dropped it? Who would notice such a fragment? Not everyone, only the one who worked with the glass. The Reverend Sinclair raised a trembling hand. Then it is clear. This man Hart has knowledge, has motive. Surely. Non, monsieur, Poirot interrupted softly, his tone almost indulgent. It is never so simple. The obvious suspect, he is the gift that murder offers too readily. One must not be so easily satisfied. Still, the shadow had been cast. Hart sat rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Miss Reeves whispered something quickly into Lady Constance's ear. Dr. Markham pinched the bridge of his nose as though restraining impatience. Hastings, unable to restrain himself, leaned close to Poirot. But really, old chap, isn't it plain enough? Who else could have marked the glass with such skill? You've cornered him. Poirot's mustaches quivered in amusement. My dear Hastings, always you would marry the first suspect who comes courting. But no, no. Murder is vain. It wishes to appear too easy. There is another layer beneath. We shall peel it away, and then perhaps another. Only when there is nothing left to conceal shall we have the truth. He addressed the company once more. For now, Monsieur Hart will remain under observation. But beware, Miss Amos, the true culprit is clever. He has placed before us a false trail. We must not stumble. The rain beat briefly against the windows, and somewhere a door slammed. The house seemed to draw its breath, waiting. Suspicion had chosen its target, but Poirot, with a glint in his eye, had already begun to look elsewhere. The tide turned again in the afternoon, creeping stealthily back across the flats. Within the house, the atmosphere grew thick with unspoken fear. The servants moved in whispers, trays were carried with trembling hands, and no one strayed far from the drawing-room where Poirot maintained his quiet dominion. The sense of isolation, with the causeway drowned beneath grey water, was like a tightening cord. Felix Hart had withdrawn into himself, his expression tight as though behind glass. The others gave him a wide berth, suspicion already weaving its net about him. Poirot, however, busied himself with small errands. He examined the glasses again, studied the note beneath the ormolu clock, and stooped, meticulously, to retrieve every speck from the rug. To Hastings, it looked like fussing. To Poirot, each gesture was a step in a silent waltz of logic. It was while inspecting the rug a second time that Poirot paused suddenly, his small frame taut with interest. He held up something between finger and thumb, a narrow, blackened shred no larger than a matchstick. Regardez, Hastings. What do you see? Hastings bent. Why, a bit of charred thread, I should think. Precisely. A fiber burnt at one end. And where was it? Wedged in the carpet beside the locket. Now, Hastings, why should there be such a thing there? I can't imagine, Hastings admitted. Some scrap from the fire. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Non, mon ami. The grate is swept clean. This fiber, see, it is stiffened with wax. A candlewick, perhaps, or the drawstring of a little bag scorched by flame. Think. A bag, small enough to conceal a vial? Or a packet of powder? He straightened, mustaches bristling. Someone, Hastings, carried poison in a manner most convenient, and in haste, it brushed the flame of the candle on the mantelpiece. Voila! A careless detail, but it betrays a careful crime. Hastings whistled. Then Hart can't be the man. He hadn't moved from the terrace, by his own account, and no one saw him near the fire. Poirot smiled gently. Exactment. We must now ask, who stood by the hearth? Who bent to the locket? Who reached for the clock? His eyes swept the company, who watched with varying shades of guilt and alarm. It narrows, does it not? Lady Constance gave a small cry. But it was I who bent to Morton when he fell. You cannot suggest. Calm yourself, madam. I suggest nothing yet. But the fiber, it tells us that the poison was carried into this room, not fetched from a sideboard. There is cunning here. The poisoned glass, it may be a blind, the true act lay elsewhere. Consider, cyanide, even in tiny amounts, has a bitterness that betrays itself in drink. But placed upon the rim, upon the lips, the victim tastes nothing until too late. Julia Greville's eyes flashed. Then the killer must have been beside him at the moment. Lady Constance was nearest. The words hung like a challenge. Sir Alistair sprang up angrily, but Poirot silenced him with a raised hand. Patience, monsieur. It is too soon to accuse. We observe only. Lady Constance bent to aid him. That does not mean she gave him death. And yet, Poirot held up the charred fiber again. The fire has whispered to us. A small detail, but the details, they are everything. With them we shall reconstruct the truth. Hastings, watching the company, felt the shift in the room. Suspicion had begun to loosen from Felix's heart and creep towards Lady Constance. Miss Reeves's hand fluttered protectively to her mistress's shoulder. Dr. Markham frowned as though calculating a dosage. The Reverend whispered, "Lead us not into temptation." Poirot tucked the scrap neatly into his pocketbook. "Miss Amos, one more thing. Who among you entered this room before the discovery? Who touched the mantel, the clock, the fire? I ask you now to search your memories, for the smallest gesture may condemn or save you." A silence followed, deep and uneasy. Outside, the estuary lay still beneath its heavy sky. Within, the net of suspicion tightened, drawn not by conjecture but by a thread no thicker than a candlewick. The rain eased by late afternoon, leaving the garden sodden and shining with the glisten of wet laurel leaves. From the drawing-room windows the estuary looked leaden, the water creeping higher against the sea wall. Seabourne House stood like a ship adrift with fear. Within, conversation had dwindled into whispers. Poirot, however, was serene. His neat hands folded as though the gathering were a tea party rather than a conclave of suspects. At his request, the household assembled once more. Hastings noticed the reluctance in every movement. Sir Alistair pacing with irritation, Julia Greville's stillness sharp as a blade, heart taut and pale, Lady Constance leaning against Miss Reeves as though for strength. Poirot, immaculate as ever, adjusted a chair by an inch and looked round the circle with mild satisfaction. "Now," he began, "murder is never born in a vacuum. Always there are the small miseries, the hidden quarrels, the debts unpaid, the loves concealed. One must draw them into the light. Shall we?" The silence was heavy. Poirot's gaze lingered on Julia Greville. "You, mademoiselle, you looked at the locket last night with an expression that was not admiration. It was resentment. Why?" Julia lifted her chin. "If you must know, the locket once belonged to my mother. She gave it to Lady Constance on her deathbed, against my father's wishes. I thought it unjust. That is all." "Not all, I think," Poirot said gently. "For a woman does not look at silver with such bitterness unless memory also weighs upon it." Julia's face flushed. "If I had wanted it, I should have asked. But I did not kill Morton Hale for a trinket." "Perhaps not. But the locket," Poirot's eyes gleamed, "it is the key to much more than silver." Sir Alistair broke in impatiently. "This is folly. What has an old locket to do with Hale's death? The real matter is money. He pressed me, Poirot, for an investment in his hotels. I refused. He threatened exposure, letters, foolish letters I wrote years ago in America when fortune was kinder. He said he would show them to Bryce, to creditors. That is motive enough, but for him, not for me." There was a startled murmur. Lady Constance's hand tightened on her handkerchief. Hastings, watching Poirot, saw no surprise, only confirmation. Dr. Markham, standing near the hearth, gave a dry laugh. "If we are confessing sins, I might add one. Hale owed me a bill he never paid. He promised me shares in a company that never existed. I did not poison him, but had I known he would collapse, I might have spared myself the trouble of sending reminders." Poirot regarded him with an approving nod. "Candor, doctor, it is refreshing. But the poison, no, it required more cunning. One must know more than debts to employ cyanide." The Reverend Sinclair shifted uneasily. Morton Hale had no faith. He mocked me openly last night. He said the church was a relic, like the folly on the lawn. I prayed for patience, but my anger was sharp. Yet I am no murderer. Miss Reeves suddenly spoke, her voice low but firm. You are wrong, Reverend. It was not faith he mocked, it was Lady Constance. I heard him in the corridor after dinner. He said cruel things, things I will not repeat. She bore it with dignity, but I saw how it cut her. A gasp broke from Lady Constance. Eleanor, you should not. It must be said, Reeves insisted. You must know, Poirot. Lady Constance has enemies enough without false accusations. She loved her guest as she loves all who cross her threshold. But he insulted her, and I cannot forgive it. Poirot's eyes softened. Loyalty, mademoiselle, it speaks volumes. Yet loyalty can blind as well as defend. We must weigh it carefully. Then Felix Hart, silent till now, spoke with sudden intensity. You look at me, monsieur, as though I had scratched the glass. Yes, I quarreled with Hale. But do you know why? Because he claimed to have purchased jewels that once belonged to the Greville family, this very family. He said he could prove it, that the locket was only a fragment of what he had uncovered. Lies, of course. But he meant to use them. That is why I warned him to leave such matters alone. All eyes turned to Lady Constance, who pressed a trembling hand to her throat. He said something of the kind to me, too. That the locket concealed more than sentiment, that it held a secret worth a fortune. I laughed at him. But perhaps he was not laughing. Poirot rose, his voice crisp. Voila! Now the motives stand in a row, like soldiers on parade. Money, jealousy, resentment, insult, betrayal. Hale touched every nerve in this house. Any one of you had cause to wish him dead. But only one carried poison in a hidden bag, left its trace upon the fire, and chose the moment with precision. To find that one, I must press harder. The rain began again, spattering against the windows. Hastings felt the claustrophobia of the house close about him. Each confession, each quarrel brought them nearer, not to clarity, but to a deeper fog. Yet Poirot, serene, seemed to see a shape forming in the mist. By evening the house felt heavier than the weather pressing against its walls. The tide had risen to the folly steps, cutting them off entirely. Lamps were lit, casting long reflections across polished floors, and the scent of wax mingled with the faint salt dampness seeping in from the estuary. Conversation had dwindled to half-sentences, and each guest seemed caught in the web of their own thoughts. Poirot, however, was restless. He moved about the drawing-room with the care of a man adjusting chessmen, touching here a candlestick, there a cushion. To Hastings it seemed mere fussing, but the detective's small eyes were sharp, watchful. My friends, he said at last, there is still something that does not speak the truth. We have heard motives, confessions of quarrels, whispers of debts. But always I feel, how shall I put it? The resistance. As though behind each word lies another, unsaid. That cannot remain. Truth, it pushes like steam, it must escape. The silence deepened. Then Julia Greville rose suddenly, her dark eyes blazing. Very well, monsieur. If you want truth, you shall have it. Her voice carried across the room with startling force. Morton Hale was not merely a guest. He was my fiancé. A stunned murmur broke from the others. Sir Alistair dropped heavily into a chair. Lady Constance gave a cry of dismay. Yes, Julia continued, her voice trembling but proud. We were to announce it soon. He swore he loved me, that together we should restore the family fortunes. I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. And then, 2 nights ago, I learned the truth. He had deceived me. There was another woman in London, perhaps more than one. He was a scoundrel. Last night I confronted him. I told him it was over. He laughed in my face. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips, but her eyes never left Poirot's. So now you have my motive, monsieur. But know this, I wished him misery, not death. I would not have poisoned him, even if I had the means. My pride would not stoop so low. The room trembled with the shock of her confession. Lady Constance rose and went to her, clasping her hands. "My dear child, why did you not tell us? We would have. You would have forbidden it," Julia said bitterly. "You and Uncle Alastair both. Hale knew it. He used it to sneer at me." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Mademoiselle, you have done bravely. To conceal such pain, it poisons the spirit, n'est-ce pas? Now you are free of it." But even as he spoke, Hastings saw how the revelation shifted suspicion. The others looked at Julia with a new wariness. The woman scorned, the betrayed fiancé, her motive more urgent than any debt or insult. Dr. Markham broke the silence with dry abruptness. "So that is why you kept to your room yesterday. I wondered at the shadows beneath your eyes. But you are right, mademoiselle. Hale was a scoundrel. Many here had cause to hate him. Not only you." Sir Alastair stirred. "She is a child," he muttered. "She did not know what she was doing." "Non, non," Poirot said firmly. "Mademoiselle is no child. She is a woman who loved, and who suffered. That makes her dangerous, yes, but not necessarily guilty. Do not confuse passion with crime." Miss Reeves, who had been silent, spoke suddenly. "Monsieur Poirot is right. If anyone had the heart to kill, it was not Julia. It was me." Every head turned. Reeves's face was pale, but her voice was steady. "I heard what Hale said to Lady Constance. I heard him mock her, insult her. I swore to myself I would protect her. If I had found the means, I might have done it. That is the truth." Lady Constance gave a sharp exclamation. "Eleanor, do not speak such madness." But Reeves continued, calm and defiant. "You wanted truth, monsieur. There it is. I would have killed him for you. I did not, but I wished it." Poirot studied her for a long moment, then shook his head gently. "You are loyal to the last, mademoiselle. But wishing is not doing. The hand that poured the poison, it was steady, practiced. Not yours." The room was still again, but its stillness was different. Raw, exposed. Secrets lay bare, motives confessed, loyalties strained. The careful politeness of the country weekend had shattered. Poirot looked round, his eyes gleaming. "Now, Mies Amos, we are nearer. The lies have surfaced, the masks have cracked. Soon the murderer will have nowhere left to hide." Hastings felt the air tighten like a drum before the first stroke. They had passed from suspicion to passion, from whispers to cries. And in the midst of it, Poirot was calm, his little gray cells alive with a pattern only he could see. Evening descended with a swiftness peculiar to September. One moment a dull gray afternoon, the next the house wrapped in shadow, the estuary dark as ink. Lamps glowed in the drawing room, and the fire crackled softly, though its warmth did little to banish the chill that had settled upon the company. Dinner had been a muted affair, each course eaten mechanically, conversations halting. Poirot alone seemed untroubled, attending to his plate with neat, deliberate movements and discoursing on the virtues of balance in sauces as if no corpse lay but a room away. Afterwards, when the servants had cleared the dishes and the company assembled once more, Poirot remained standing by the hearth. His eyes gleamed, and Hastings, watching him, felt the stir of anticipation. Poirot was preparing for something. One could sense it in the perfect stillness of his hands, in the precision with which he adjusted his cuffs. "Miss Amos," he said at last, "it is time for clarity. You have each spoken, you have each concealed. Murder thrives in shadows, so I bring you light. You will indulge me, s'il vous plaît, in a little experiment." He gestured to Mrs. Drake, who had placed on the sideboard a tray with 3 clean glasses and the decanter of brandy. "We will repeat the scene of this morning. Captain Hastings, you will kindly sit in the very chair Monsieur Hale occupied. Do not look so alarmed, mon ami. Your role is but symbolic." Some of the guests shifted uneasily. Julia gave a low protest, but Poirot silenced her with a raised hand. "It is necessary. You will see why." Hastings obeyed, lowering himself into the chair by the window, where Hale had drunk his last. Poirot moved to the sideboard. With careful fingers he poured brandy into one glass, then another, then the third, setting them in a neat row. His eyes roamed the room, pausing briefly on each face. "You see, it is simple. A man pours. He drinks. He dies. But, Was it so? None. This morning I found a fiber charred at one end by the fire. I found a glass with a rim most curiously marked. And I found a locket, broken, lying where it should not have been. All small things, but murder hides in the small things. He leaned forward slightly. Now, let each of you, in turn, approach the tray. Take up one glass, examine it, and replace it. Do not fear, there is no poison now. But the gesture, it is revealing. We shall see how each hand betrays the mind. One by one they obeyed. Sir Alistair, brusque and irritated, snatched a glass and put it down with a clatter. Julia touched hers lightly, her eyes on the floor. Hart examined the rim minutely, almost with professional pride, before replacing it without a word. Dr. Markham weighed the glass as though it were a specimen, his brow furrowed. The Reverend Sinclair muttered a prayer as he lifted his, then set it back quickly. Miss Reeves hesitated longest, finally touching the stem with trembling fingers. Lady Constance approached last, her movements elegant but visibly shaken. She brushed the rim with her thumb before returning it. Throughout, Poirot watched with hawk-like intensity, not so much at the glasses as at the eyes and hands that handled them. When Lady Constance sat down again, he clapped his hands softly. Très bien. Now we have seen. The nervous, the bold, the indifferent, it is all there. Hastings, you may rise. Relieved, Hastings returned to his chair, though he could not see what Poirot had gained from the ritual. Poirot's voice deepened. One among you handled the glass as he, or she, handled it this morning. With knowledge, with intention. And that, Amos, I have observed. A shiver passed around the room. Poirot did not point, not yet. Instead, he turned suddenly towards the mantelpiece, where the ormolu clock ticked its false time. He took from beneath it the folded slip of paper. Remember, it says. Remember what? Remember whom? It is no idle word. It is the murderer's whisper. This note was placed to draw attention, to create confusion. But in creating, it betrayed. He slipped the note into his pocket and turned back. We are near, very near. I have but one or two questions more, and then the truth will stand naked. Tomorrow, when the tide falls, the police will arrive, but by then Hercule Poirot will have already revealed the guilty one. His eyes glittered as he swept the room. So tonight, Amos, sleep lightly, for I have set the trap, and in the morning we shall see who struggles within it. The fire hissed as a log shifted. Outside, the sea pressed closer, hemming them in. Inside, no one spoke. Each guest, Hastings thought, looked as though they already felt the noose tightening, not knowing yet on whose neck it would fall. Morning came with a pale sun breaking through the remnants of storm, glinting off the estuary like tarnished silver. The tide had turned, but the causeway remained under water. They were still imprisoned in Seabourne House, suspended in a kind of uneasy limbo. Breakfast was a formal misery. Cups rattled against saucers, voices faltered, and every eye flicked toward Poirot, who seemed entirely absorbed in buttering his toast to symmetrical perfection. When the meal was over, he rose with his usual fastidious grace. Mess Amos, he said, the time has come. The murderer has played his hand, but Hercule Poirot has seen each card. If you will be so good as to join me in the library, I shall set in order all that has seemed confusion. The company obeyed, reluctant yet compelled, as if drawn by some invisible cord. The library, with its tall shelves and somber oak panels, became a courtroom. Chairs were set in a semicircle, and Poirot took his place before the hearth, his small figure radiating calm authority. Hastings hovered near, notebook in hand though he seldom wrote, too intent upon the drama unfolding. Poirot began quietly. First, let us recall the facts. Morton Hale dies of cyanide, swiftly, violently. The glass in his hand appears to be the instrument. Yet, the brandy is innocent. Where, then, was the poison? Not in the decanter. No, my friends, it was upon the rim itself. A thin smear, invisible but deadly. Only when his lips touched it did death come. That is why we found no bitterness in the drink. He held up the shard of glass retrieved from the carpet. This fragment tells us the method. Someone scratched the rim, creating a groove to hold the poison. But in handling the glass they left behind a sliver, and that was their undoing. Felix's heart stirred. You have said yourself, monsieur, that only a jeweler would think of such a thing. All eyes have been upon me. Yet I swear I am innocent. Poirot inclined his head. Yes, Monsieur Hart. Too innocent, perhaps. For the murderer wished us to think precisely that the jeweler, with his delicate tools, had engineered the trick. It is what we call a red herring, NSCE pas? But a red herring, it leaves a strong smell. A faint stir of relief passed over Hart's face. The others leaned forward. Poirot drew from his pocket the blackened fiber. Then there is this. A charred thread, stiffened with wax. A careless fragment dropped beside the fire. What does it tell us? That the poison was carried in a small bag, perhaps of velvet or cord, which brushed a candle and burned. Who, then, carried such a thing? Not our jeweler. But consider, our good Dr. Markham, with his parcel of medicines. A bag, yes. Bottles, vials. Always he has such things at hand. Dr. Markham bristled. Are you suggesting? Calm yourself, doctor. I suggest nothing, yet. But note, you had the knowledge of poisons, the opportunity to conceal them. And yet, I examined your parcel. Harmless tonics, clearly labeled. If you had chosen cyanide, would you so clumsily allow a thread to burn and betray you? None. You are a careful man. He paced a few steps, turned, and raised a finger. So who, then? Who had both the chance to be close at the moment of death and the motive to wish Hale gone? His gaze rested on Lady Constance. She flinched, one hand rising instinctively to her bare throat. The locket's absence was conspicuous. Oui, madam. It is with you that the truth lies. The locket, the chain broken, it was no accident. In the moment you bent over Hale, you pretended to help him. But in truth, you snapped the clasp deliberately and let the locket fall, to mask the gesture by which you pressed the poisoned glass to his lips. A woman's hand, light and quick, could do this unseen. When the body was discovered, the locket on the floor appeared natural. But it was stagecraft. You, Lady Constance, were the actress. The room erupted, gasps, exclamations, the scrape of a chair. Sir Alistair surged to his feet. Poirot, you dare accuse? Poirot raised his palm. Sit, monsieur. Hear all. For it was not only insult that drove her. Hale threatened exposure. Old letters of your youth, Sir Alistair, yes? Letters that would ruin you, ruin your wife's position. He taunted her with them. And more, he hinted that the locket contained proof, a miniature, some secret that tied the Grievilles to scandal. Lady Constance could not permit it. Pride, honor, family, these she valued above all. She acted to protect them. Lady Constance's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes, wide with shock and pain, moved from face to face. Poirot's voice softened. You are a gracious woman, madam, but proud. Too proud to plead, too proud to beg. Instead, you chose the surest silence for a man who threatened you, death. Yet you forgot one thing, that Hercule Poirot sees the little things. The charred fiber, the broken chain, the false note beneath the clock. All were your handiwork, meant to confuse, but together they formed the pattern. At last she spoke, her voice low and strained. Yes, it is true. I did it. A collective sigh passed round the room, as though the house itself released its breath. I could not endure his threats, she whispered. He mocked me, mocked my family. He held my husband's honor in his hand like a toy. I thought only to preserve us. The locket, I meant it to draw suspicion, but not so cleverly as you have shown, monsieur. Poirot bowed slightly, his expression grave. It is never clever enough, madam. Murder cannot be neat. It always leaves a corner untucked. Sir Alistair sank into his chair, covering his face. Julia rose and crossed swiftly to her aunt, but Lady Constance lifted a hand to keep her back. No, she said quietly. I will face what I have done. Poirot's eyes, for all their triumph, held a glimmer of sadness. It is finished. When the tide falls and the police arrive, you will make your statement. Until then, madam, I ask only for dignity. You have acted, yes, but you have also suffered. Let us remember that. The library was silent save for the ticking of the clock, still obstinately declaring the wrong time. Hastings closed his notebook, though he had scarcely written a word. He thought of the violets that had perfumed the house, of the silver locket now tarnished with guilt, and of Poirot, immaculate, implacable, who had once more drawn order from chaos with his little gray cells. The tide at last had begun to ebb. From the library window Hastings could see the dark spine of the causeway breaking through the water, glistening like the back of some sea creature rising to breathe. Within the house there was the hush that follows a storm, though no wind stirred. It was the hush of revelation, of exhaustion, of shame. Lady Constance had withdrawn to her chamber, Miss Reeves at her side, the housekeeper moving with hushed footsteps about the corridor like a nurse in a sick room. Sir Alistair sat in the smoking chair with head bowed, as though his shoulders carried the weight of generations. Julia Greville, her composure regained, stared fixedly out at the estuary. No one spoke to her. Poirot, neat as ever, remained in the library, polishing his spectacles with a silk handkerchief. His little figure seemed oddly untouched by the emotional wreckage around him. Yet Hastings, who knew him well, detected in the precise movements a sorrowful restraint. At length, Poirot spoke. "So it ends, mon ami. The police will come when the waters allow. They will take Lady Constance to face justice. The case, it is closed." Hastings could not repress a sigh. "It feels terribly sad, Poirot. She is a fine woman, proud, yes, but noble. And now all ruined." Poirot set down his spectacles. "Oui, Hastings. It is always sad. Murder destroys not only the victim, but the murderer, the family, the house itself. It is like a rot that spreads through the beams until all trembles. Lady Constance thought she acted from honor. Yet pride," he lifted a finger, "pride is often the mask of fear." Hastings frowned. "Fear of exposure, you mean?" "Just so. She feared the shame, the gossip, the collapse of reputation more than she feared the taking of a man's life. It is often so in England, mon cher Hastings. Here reputation is everything. Families are ruined by whispers more than by bankruptcy." Hale understood this. He threatened, he jeered, and she answered with poison. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the fire settle with a faint hiss. Hastings felt the weight of the house pressing in on him, the heavy curtains, the stern shelves of books, the ormolu clock still obstinately wrong. Poirot rose and adjusted the candlesticks on the mantelpiece, aligning them to exact symmetry. "You see, order must be restored. That is why I do what I do. Not merely to catch the murderer, but to set the world straight again. Without order, we are lost." Hastings looked at him keenly. "But you don't believe justice will be merciful, do you? Lady Constance, she killed for love of her family." Poirot's eyes softened. "Justice, Hastings, is like the tide. It comes whether we call it or no. But mercy, mercy belongs to God. I, Hercule Poirot, I deal only with truth. What the law or heaven does after, it is not in my hands." From the corridor came the faint tread of footsteps, a murmur of voices. The servants were whispering. The news was spreading like smoke. Poirot took up his cane and adjusted his hat, preparing for departure. "You see, mon ami," he said, "human hearts, they are like the locket. Closed, pretty, yet within, secrets, sometimes poison. But always there is a clue, a small imperfection that betrays. One must use the little gray cells to see it. That is all." They stepped together into the hall, where the household lingered in subdued groups. No one spoke as Poirot passed. The detective inclined his head courteously, but his eyes were distant, already turning to the next puzzle the world would set before him. At the door Hastings paused, glancing back at the somber house. The estuary lay still beyond, the causeway darkening under the retreating tide. Somewhere, a dog barked once, sharp and accusing. Poirot tapped his cane upon the step. "Come, Hastings. There will be a train at Malden. Life goes on, even after tragedy. Remember that." And so they left Seabourne House, its secrets bared, its honor shattered, its order restored by the relentless symmetry of Hercule Poirot's mind. The following morning dawned cool and clear, as though the storm and its secrets had been washed away with the tide. The estuary shimmered with a pale light, gulls wheeled above the water, and the causeway at last stretched bare and passable. Yet within Seabourne House, the air remained heavy, laden with the weight of confession. Lady Constance descended the stairs with unflinching poise, dressed in dark silk, Miss Reeves beside her like a shadow. Her face was composed, but her eyes were distant, as though she already walked apart from the world she had sought to preserve. The others, gathered silently in the hall, made no move to approach her. Sir Alistair stood rigid, his hands gripping the head of his cane, the color drained from his cheeks. Julia's eyes glistened, though she refused to weep. The clatter of motor wheels on the gravel announced the arrival of the constable from Malden, accompanied by a detective inspector of grave aspect. The formalities were brief. Words of caution, words of duty, and then Lady Constance, with the faintest inclination of her head, surrendered herself. "I am ready," she said simply. Poirot watched, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed not on the departing figure but on the faces left behind. "It is always so," he murmured to Hastings, who stood at his side. "One death begets another. The victim of poison lies cold, but pride, reputation, love, they too are slain. It is why I say, Hastings, that murder is the most illogical of crimes. The murderer gains nothing, yet loses all." As the motor carried Lady Constance away across the shining causeway, silence fell again upon the hall. Dr. Markham cleared his throat but said nothing. The Reverend whispered a prayer no one seemed to hear. Hart stared at the floor, his professional pride stung by how nearly he had been cast as villain. Julia withdrew to the stair, her dark figure a portrait of grief contained. At last Poirot placed his hat upon his head and tapped his cane briskly. "Come, mon ami," he said to Hastings. "Our part is finished. The law will take its course, and time will perform its slow surgery. For us, there is a train from Malden, and in London perhaps a comfortable dinner." They stepped out into the bright morning air. The house behind them stood with its windows blank, like a stage after the play has ended. The Folly gleamed in the distance, purposeless as ever, and the estuary lapped quietly at the stones, indifferent to human tragedy. As they crossed the causeway, Hastings ventured, "Do you regret it, Poirot?" Exposing her. Poirot's mustaches quivered. "Regret, mon ami, is for what might have been. I deal only in what is. Truth, it must be seen. Without truth there is no order, and without order there is nothing. Lady Constance chose her path when she lifted the poisoned glass. I merely revealed the footprints she left upon it." He paused, gazing out across the gleaming flats. "Yet, Hastings, there is always the pity. Murder springs from weakness as often as from wickedness. One must never forget that." They walked on in silence. Behind them, Seabourne House faded into distance, its proud walls diminished against the sweep of sky and tide. Ahead lay the promise of London, of trains and bustle, of fresh cases waiting to be untangled. But Hastings knew he would never forget the silver locket glinting on the rug, nor the proud figure of Lady Constance surrendering with dignity to her fate. For in the theatre of crime, it was not only the guilty who were condemned, but all who loved them. Poirot quickened his pace, cane tapping smartly. "Come, Hastings. The world waits. Always there is another curtain to rise."